The, the book, as Charles said, has this thread that deals with Native American lands and Bears Ears. It has a thread that deals with a biography of Teddy Roosevelt, and it has a thread which is my own road trip. So the book, I had no idea the book would be quite as timely as it was, but we're going to have Teddy Roosevelt on later, and as his daughter said of him, he wanted to be the bride at every wedding, the corpse at every funeral, and the baby at every christening. And he tended to be this sinkhole for attention, had some similarities with our current president, born in New York, silver spoon, all that, and actually famously had small hands. But of course, the differences are just immense between these two men. One being that Mr. Roosevelt read a book a night and was always a grower. And it's a Wallace Stegner term he used quite a bit. He was always expanding in his sense of empathy. But what's been funny to me in the last month as the book has come out is we've had the president talk about Yosemite or Yoseminite, as he also pronounced it. We've had the Roosevelt statue coming down, which I agree with, but as a compensatory gesture, the Natural History Museum has renamed its Hall of Biodiversity after Roosevelt, which makes sense. The thing is, Roosevelt, as a child, as a teenager, didn't want to be a statesman, didn't want to be a soldier. He dreamed of being a working naturalist like his hero, Charles Darwin. And his studying of birds, in particular, led to his writing. His writing came out because of his observation of birds. He would eventually write 47 books, which is another way he's quite different than our current president. So anyway, to start with that current president, he's really one of the reasons the book came into being. Charles Wilkinson was part of this too. In 2016, a bunch of us contributed to a book called Red Rock Testimony, and it was with Tory House Press, the press that I'm happy to say I might be publishing that book with come May. And it was distributed to all members of Congress, and it was part of the appeal to President Obama to save Bears Ears National Monument, which he did in December of 2016. Thrilling moment for a lot of us, certainly more thrilling for the native tribes, the 5 tribes that had united to create the Bears Ears proposal, but thrilling for us too. You felt kind of connected to government and empowered in a way you rarely do. That's why it was kind of like a body slam when 10 months later, Ryan Zinke, then Secretary of the Interior, standing in front of a portrait of Roosevelt on what would have been October 27th, which would have been Roosevelt's 159th birthday, and claiming he was a Roosevelt Republican, unsaved Bears Ears, taking away 85% of it. That is the case that is still pending in that District of Columbia court. And for me, it brought a lot of things together. I had already been studying the Antiquities Act, already been thinking a little bit about Roosevelt, but suddenly I was like, this is the book, this is the project. And in fact, I wrote the proposal over the next couple of weeks and headed out to Utah in early January 2018. I was very lucky in that my first interview subject there was Regina Lopez White Skunk, Ute Mountain Ute, member of the Bears Ears Intertribal Council. And she was fantastic. She was at my last talk that I just did in virtual Montana. And she said to me, look, in creating this proposal, we are not trying to relive historical trauma. We are not saying, give us our land back. What we are doing is studying this tool of the United States government, a tool that wasn't created by Roosevelt, but was first employed by Roosevelt. And we are using it for a new purpose, which is saving tribal land. And what I started to see during that time was this confluence of America's best idea, as Wallace Stegner called America's parks, and we'll add monuments to that, and an older tribal ideal. And I thought, this is a new vision of saving land and the parks. And it was really exciting. And of course, it was also at the moment a threatened vision. So I think I sold the book while I was walking over the Glen Canyon Dam on my proposal. It was pretty funny, like a nod to Ed Abbey. And that summer, after school ended, I headed out west with my nephew Noah. And first we went up the coast. My old classmate Jamie Raskin is in Congress, and he met with us. This is before they were a majority in the House. And so he felt very out of power himself. He's since become much more active. Then we headed up to Cambridge, and I studied Roosevelt's papers at Harvard, and then we headed west. And I think I saw Jim is here, so we stopped at his house in Lodi, in Wisconsin, and then we pushed on to the Badlands and experienced that scene I just described. And so the kind of rest of the trip was an echo, in a way, of Theodore Roosevelt's 1903 trip, which was the first ever whistle-stop tour. In fact, it was the first time a sitting president had ever campaigned. And he didn't just campaign, he campaigned to the tune of 14,000 miles around the country. And so this might be a good time to invite Teddy himself to join us. I think he can, there he is. Well, welcome.
Thank you.
So, two things I want to ask you to kick off here. And
Yes.
The first is, if you can talk a little bit about the stop in Yellowstone, which was so important.
Oh, yes.
And then work our way to the Grand Canyon, which gave the book its title, Leave It As It Is, which I find very convenient in many things. You know, somebody tries to touch something, like, leave it as it is. It's a handy phrase, but I like it for nature most of all. So if you want to take it away, Teddy.
I'd be delighted, yes. Well, I started my tour on April 1st at Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Then we traveled across Illinois, Wisconsin to Minnesota. And then on April 6th, we arrived in North Dakota. And on April 7th, I arrived in the town that was the base of my ranching when I was a Dakota rancher, Medora, North Dakota. I enjoyed some hospitality from those who lived there, and with me was the great naturalist, Mr. John Burroughs. We traveled on the next day, and on that day arrived at Livingston and Gardner, Montana, and then spent 2 weeks just camping and enjoying Yellowstone with Mr. Burroughs. We were listening to the songs of the birds and just having a bully time. But no, after that 2 weeks, yes.
And just imagine the president of the United, well, not the current president, but imagine a president who, you know, has these reporters with him in the Secret Service just saying at the gates of Yellowstone,
No.
Sorry, we're going to go. And there's one day where that I have these third person sections in the book that it cuts back and forth between. And one of is him just wandering off and spending the day observing and counting elk in Yellowstone. Oh, yeah. Good job there, Teddy, on that.
Oh, thank you. I had a bully time. Well, after we left Yellowstone, we headed down through Wyoming and Nebraska and on around through Iowa and spent some time in St. Louis and then Kansas. And then finally, on May 4th, I arrived in your great state of Colorado. I spent time in Denver, at Palmer Lake, Colorado Springs, among others, but thoroughly enjoyed that. And then 2 days later, I arrived at the Grand Canyon in Arizona. And it was there, Mr. Gessner, would you like me to give the speech, the beginning of that?
That would be wonderful.
Thank you. In the Grand Canyon, Arizona has a natural wonder which, so far as I know, is in kind absolutely unparalleled throughout the rest of the world. I want to ask you to do one thing in connection with it in your own interest and in the interest of the country, to keep this great wonder of nature as it now is. I was delighted to learn of the wisdom of the Santa Fe Railroad people in deciding not to build their hotel on the brink of the canyon. I hope you will not have a building of any kind, not a summer cottage, a hotel, or anything else to mar the wonderful grandeur, the sublimity, the great loneliness, and the beauty of the canyon. Leave it as it is. You cannot improve on it. The ages have been at work on it, and man can only mar it. What you can do is to keep it for your children, and your children's children, and for all who come after you, as one of the great sights which every American, if he can travel at all, should see.
Thank you. A lot of things about that speech are interesting. In fact, the book begins in one of these third-person interludes with Roosevelt arriving at the canyon, having written most of the speech because he's speeding around, and but he hasn't seen the Grand Canyon yet. So he goes up that morning on horseback to the edge and sees the great purple bruise, and to the amazement of people with him, identifies birds as he goes. One quick aside, which I think Teddy will like, is there was a cabinet meeting where he came rushing in, where Roosevelt came rushing in and said, "I have important news." And they said, "What is it?" Wondering if they were going to war. And he said, "I've just seen a chestnut-sided warbler, and it is only February." So birding continued to be a big part of his life.
Yes.
But so he gets up to the Grand Canyon, and I theorize that he did a little revising of what he'd written. Because one of the themes of the book is going to places that meant a lot to someone is a way to start to get to know that person. And another theme as a writer is words come from the land and come from specific landscapes. This speech, which I compare to the Gettysburg Address of environmentalism, is really interesting in a lot of ways. And the children's children thing is really brilliant because it connects us by blood to the future and to the land. And of course, it's as Nina, who I just noticed is here, my wife, pointed out to me, that's great that Teddy said it, but Native American thinkers had been thinking that way for centuries. And so it's just a way of thinking that we don't have now. And that is kind of my comeback a lot when people are talking about Roosevelt's prejudices and chauvinism and bigotry, which I'm very aware of and call out in the book. But one prejudice he did not share that most of us have is anthropocentrism. He was able to see beyond the human. He was able to really, partly because of his teenage studies, see the world of plants, of animals, of fungi, and really his saving of those places and those wild things was totally related to his love and empathy for those things. Trip kept going too, because Roosevelt, for all his leave it as it isnness, a buddy of mine from California just sent me a picture of him behind a bulldozer in a ceremonial picture digging out the Panama Canal, and he said another saying of Roosevelt's was "dig a big hole." So he had another side. So from the Grand Canyon, we go hurtling on to California, where one of the most famous moments of the trip occur. And if you could narrate that for us, that would be awesome.
Oh, I'd be delighted. Yes, we traveled for a week through California. And then on May 15th, I was with Mr. John Muir, and we camped our first night at Mariposa Grove under the grizzly giant. I had 40 wool army blankets as my bedding that night, but I wanted to tour Yosemite with Mr. Muir. Of all the people in the world, he was the one I knew it would be most worthwhile to see it with. But we had great conversations, even though Mr. Muir had the habit of putting little twigs in each buttonhole of my coat. I kept brushing them off, but...
He was a damn hippie, that Muir.
Well, then on May 16th, we camped at Sentinel Dome, and we awakened the next morning to 5 inches of snow on our bedding. But we traversed through the snow, and finally on May 17th, we camped at the edge of Bridal Veil Meadow in the Yosemite Valley. Mr. Muir's main focus of conversation that evening was the need for forest preservation and conservation. And also, he was concerned that the California state grant of Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa Grove, which surrounded in 1892 by Yosemite National Park, that those be receded to the United States. Our discussion eventually prompted me in 1906, in June, for the Yosemite Recession Bill. This took the Yosemite Valley grant and the Mariposa Big Tree Grove from state protection to federal protection as part of the Yosemite National Park. But no, I had a delightful time with Mr. Muir.
And of course, that's another of the third person interludes. And I kind of come barging in because I didn't want to be left out of that party of hanging on around the fire with you and Muir. And of course, Muir has taken a little bit of a beating lately too. And that's one of the aspects of the book where I come in and tell you guys what the future holds to some extent. But I really feel that, and one of the premises of the book is that the rough draft of saving land, of leaving it as it is, that you gave us is a powerful one for all its flaws. And a major flaw, as Charles could point out, is some of the land that was not as is, it was taken from Native people. So there's plenty to criticize. It was a good rough draft for us to use now. And the amazing thing that you did was to energize and excite the American people around an idea that didn't even really have any traction before that. And in fact, it was one of your top 3 priorities in your administration. And so I say that not only did you advocate for it, you basically created the arena in which conservation occurred. And so what this book is partly is a call for us now, rather than go back and attack past figures, take what's best from past figures and use it and revise it for our times. Bears Ears is a great example, a more inclusive ideal of nature, an ideal where it's less tourist and it's more involvement.
We have gotten past the stage, my fellow citizens, where we are to be pardoned if we treat any part of our country as something to be skinned for 2 or 3 years for the use of the present generation. Whether it is the forest, the water, the scenery, whatever it is, handle it so that your children's children will get the benefit of it.